And all right, just started recording. Welcome to our Unit 5 live session, everybody. I don't think I'm going to switch to one of those different masks today. I was rewatching maybe 10 or 15 seconds of last week's live session, and it creeped me out a lot. So I don't know how y'all felt about that mask. I still have it. If y'all do, you like the Bane mask? Maybe I should do it because I still have it. If anyone wants me to put on the mask that has this little clear thing to it, feel free to write in the chat. You can also just message me individually. I don't know if you know that you can just like choose a specific someone to chat with in your little chat thing. You could say like, hey, I actually really like that. I found that helpful. Feel free to do that. But for right now, I'm going to go without, unless somebody says, you know what, I kind of liked it. Why don't you go back? Up to y'all. You get to decide. Anyway, let's talk a little logistics about what's happening in this particular class, this unit. We talk in Unit 5. Let me go to our Blackboard course page. All right, so we do have somebody who wants to do it. I am going to make the switch. Thanks, Emma. I appreciate you. Absolutely happy to. All right, now you can see my smiling face, or at least my smiling smile, if not my entire face. Awesome. All right, so just taking a look at our Blackboard course page, we're hanging out in Unit 5. One thing I want to tell you is that I've already graded the homework assignments that you handed in for Unit 4, provided you already handed it in. And you can see my feedback on that and your grade if you go to My Grades. You should be able to see all your grades up to this point, except for, I think, the Unit 4 discussion post. I haven't gotten to them yet. But all the other grades should be there from the first 3 units. And then for Unit 4, right here, deductive arguments, you should have something here. I can't show it to you. You should be able to click on something here that's like view your assignment or view your submission. And if you click on your submission, you should see either I commented on your submission itself by like highlighting the right answers in any place where you gave the wrong answer, or writing next to it. Or for some people, given how you handed it in, I might have posted my feedback as a comment that you can look at my feedback next to it. So take a look at that. It's going to be helpful for you because this week we're having a test, and a lot of the test looks like this particular Unit 4 homework on deductive arguments. So I think that's a good place to see feedback and sort of talk through that. We'll be going over this homework assignment a little bit more in a minute, but I just wanted to let you know that that is there. All right, so other things for this class, we're in Unit 5. So I'm going to go to the Unit 5 folder under course content. I'm going to scroll down. So this week we're going to be talking about productive disagreement. That's a lot of what we're doing in class today. I'm excited for it. We're going to be learning listening skills, how to go about properly refuting or attempting to refute. We're going to learn this process of reasoning called dialectical reasoning. I really like this week of class. And we've got a few things we'll be referencing in class today during our live session. We've got a review sheet I'm gonna pull up in a minute, so you can always take a look at that. It just talks about the test that's happening this week. And then we've got the slides we'll be using, and there's going to be an in-class activity we do to end class today. That will be what we use. These are 3 of my favorite readings we do all semester, so I highly recommend you read these this week if you haven't already. This is a super shorty. It's 4 pages long, titled How to Disagree. We're going to be sort of systematically going through this particular article, particularly this like hierarchical pyramid of disagreement in class today. And then getting a little bit further down the line, a really short, literally 1-page article on offensive and defensive argumentation. And then this cool article about a weird subreddit called Change My View. that you might be interested in learning about that has some relevance to what we'll be discussing in class today. So those are the required readings. There are some other readings too that are optional if you want to take a look under resources. All right, now we're up to our assignment for class today. And this week there is only one assignment, and that assignment is a test. Right here is a description of the test and where you go to take the test. The review sheet is right at the top here. I'd like to go over some parts of that now. You can find that review sheet right there. Monique asked whether I graded 4 discussion boards. I have not graded the Unit 4 discussion boards yet. I'll be getting to those soon. But I did grade everything else, especially your homework, but also all your other Unit 3, Unit 2, and Unit 1 stuff. All right, so I'm going to pull this up, the same review sheet on Adobe so I can mess with it. So here's how a test works in our class. We have a total of 3 tests, and this is a test that you get to decide when to take it. You have to get before this particular due date of Wednesday of October 7th by 11:59 p.m. So you have to take it before then, but otherwise it's up to you. Find a time in your schedule that works for you. Maybe you want to take it right after class today. Maybe you want to set some time aside on Sunday to do it, or maybe you want to do it Tuesday afternoon or whatever. Find the time that works best for you this week to take it, and that's when you will take it. You're going to be taking it on Blackboard. You're going to, I think, devote yourself 60 minutes of free time to do this. You probably are going to be able to finish it in faster than 60 minutes, but I'm giving you 60 minutes just in case. And this is a sort of test you have to take in one sitting. Once you start taking the test in Blackboard, you're not going to be able to pause it and come back later. You have to, the timer will start once you start, and just start counting down from 60 minutes to 59 minutes, all the way down to 1 minute. And once you run out of time, it will force your submission. You won't be able to do anything more with that. So give yourself 60 minutes of devoted time to work on this. And if you've never taken one of these tests before, you have to take this in this weird thing called the Respondus lockdown browser. Some of you might have taken a Blackboard class through Kane already. Maybe you've already taken an online class, or some of your teachers use this in the spring semester when everything switched to online. But let me just tell you a little bit about this Respondus lockdown browser. There's a description of what it is right here. It's a regular old internet browser. Let me know in the chat what internet browser you use. As you can see, I'm using Chrome right now. But I also use Firefox sometimes. If I'm on a Mac, I'll use Safari. Every once in a while, I'll use Microsoft Edge, maybe Internet Explorer. I don't know which ones y'all use, but feel free to let us know. This particular browser, though, is a weird browser that, when you're using it, prevents you from using any other part of your computer while taking this particular test. So that's the reason why I'm asking you to take this test in the Respondus lockdown browser. This is essentially a closed note, closed book test. I'm not expecting you to use your book, or I guess there isn't a textbook for this class, but to use any of the readings, to use any of your notes. I'm not expecting you to go to Google to try to find the answers to these sorts of questions on the test. It's not really that type of test anyway. But just as a precaution, I'm asking you to take this test in this lockdown browser so you don't even have the ability to open up a separate tab while taking the test and try to Google to find the answer to a particular question. So if you have not gotten this browser already, you can download the browser here. I'll click on this link, and then you'll install now button. And then it's going to just run through follow the instructions when you click install now. And on probably your desktop, you're going to see an icon that maybe looks like this if you're on a PC. If you're on a Mac, the icon looks like a globe with a lock on it, and it's called Lockdown Browser. It might be in your program files, not your desktop. It might be, I'm trying to think where else it could be. It could be in that little dock at the bottom. Sometimes it gets installed right there. Most of the time it gets installed right into your desktop though. And then what you do is you close down all of your programs when you want to take the test, open that browser, and the browser will just look like a regular website. It will just be open, or look, a regular internet browser. It will be open to Kane's Blackboard page. You'll just log into Kane's Blackboard page, come back to this Unit 5 folder, come back here, click on this right here, and you'll be able to take the test. You're not going to be able to take the test if you're not in the lockdown browser. So notice I'm in Chrome right now. Watch what happens when I try to take this test in Chrome. I click begin, and wait, did I not? Whoopsie, I guess I've got to switch it so that it's required lockdown browser. Oops. Give me just 1 second while I do that. Fun for me, just so I can prove that it happens. I guess that was good that I did that. Yeah, sometimes this happens. It's a nasty error. All right, so I made it required. Let's see if I can now go back. Try this one more time to prove it. All right, I'm going to click begin again, and see now I get this error that says, hey, this assessment requires you use the lockdown browser. Please get out of this browser, start the Respondus lockdown browser, and come back to this test to continue. Don't worry about this password thing. That's just a red herring. You don't have to type in a password for this test or anything. You just have to use the Respondus lockdown browser. And on a side note, if any of you have used this lockdown browser before, some of your other teachers may have also required that you use your webcam so that the webcam monitors you while you're taking the test. I'm not requiring that, so you don't have to worry about being video recorded. You don't have to worry about having a webcam. You don't need anything like this while taking the test. All right, so that's all the lockdown stuff. It's kind of obnoxious. I recommend just sort of testing, making sure that lockdown browser works earlier in the week so that you're not sort of up against any technological issues by Wednesday. There's one additional obnoxious thing I want to mention about this lockdown browser thing for anyone who hasn't dealt with it before. Now let me switch over to not this, but this, so I can deal with it. I'm going to write something on the side here. For some reason, this browser won't work on Chromebooks. So I want to apologize in advance for anybody who has a Chromebook. You won't be able to use your Chromebook to take this particular test. If you have a Chromebook and don't have access to some other computer that's not a Chromebook, please email me to let me know, and we can try to figure out some other way to get you to take the test. Any questions, thoughts, or concerns about the lockdown browser at this time? All right. So go ahead, Helen, unmute yourself.
This isn't about the lockdown browser, it's about the test. On Blackboard, it says the test is 36 questions, but when I press that link that says that it's the review sheet, those numbers don't add up till like 32.
Right. Yeah, all will be explained when I go over this next bit as parts of the test. You're exactly right.
Okay, sorry.
It's funky math. No, don't apologize. You're asking a really good, relevant question. And Barbara asks in the chat, do we have to circle and underline for the test like the homework? You do have to do something like circling and underlining, except on Blackboard, you can't really do that, right? So I'm going to be asking you to do the equivalent of circling and underlining on Blackboard via different types of questions. So let's talk now a little bit about the test itself, like the parts of it. Just to make sure we're all on the same page though, It covers everything we're talking about these first 5 units of the class, and that includes this unit. There might be a question or two in what we're learning in class this week. It's not just the first 4 units, it's also this week. And it's worth 115 points, or 11.5% of your grade. And like I mentioned, it's closed notes, closed resources. All right, so here are the parts of the test, as we were already sort of alluding to earlier. There are essentially 5 different sections. The first section is asking you to understand some arguments. And this looks exactly like this Unit 3 participation activity we've done before, like 2 weeks ago. Remember this? I asked you to circle any premise indicators or conclusion indicators, words like because, therefore, hence, as a result, thus, this is why, that sort of stuff. And it also asks you to underline any conclusions that you find in each argument, what the one conclusion is in the argument. Well, that's what I'm going to be asking you to do, except on Blackboard, you can't circle and underline. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, for one question, I'm going to show you an argument, and I'm going to ask you to list any premise indicators or conclusion indicators. So you'll have to literally type in, I think the word because is an indicator. I think the word hence, something like that. That's what you'll be doing for that one. And then a second question related to that same argument is going to ask you to write out the conclusion. And you can just write it out word for word. So if you see this argument right here, you would write out, we must restrict protesters. That's the conclusion. Notice now there are 4 different arguments, but each argument's going to have 2 questions associated with it. So I think of this as having 4 questions on this section, but on Blackboard it's going to look like 8 questions because there are 2 questions for each one of these. So technically there are 8 questions in this first section, but really it's about 4 different arguments, 2 questions per argument. All right, a lot of the rest of the test, sections 2, 3, and 4, look like the homework from Unit 4 that all of y'all just handed in last week or earlier this week. So it looks like this homework assignment. There's going to be a section where I put arguments like this in nice, neat premise conclusion form on the test, and you have to systematically evaluate each part. So you'll check each premise to see whether it's true, false, or questionable. And this will be a multiple choice question, right? I'll say premise 1 of this argument is A, true, B, false, or C, questionable. And you just have to circle it for that one. And Shante asked whether we can go over some. Absolutely, you read my mind. That is 100% what I want to do. So we will be doing that in a minute. We'll be going over all the different sections of this homework assignment. But that's that first section right here. And for each of these arguments, there are technically 4 separate questions for each of those 4 arguments. So technically there are 16 questions in this section, even though I only think of it as 4 questions. So you see how that's already starting to add up, Helen. We've got lots more questions than you might expect, because each of these is their own separate ones for this. And then there's a section that looks like the top of the second page of our homework assignment, 8 multiple choice questions. They'll be like, for the most part, these types of questions about deductive arguments. Maybe not exclusively. Maybe there'll be 1 or 2 different questions, but they'll look like these sorts of questions. If a deductive argument's sound, do we know whether the argument's valid, invalid, or could it be either? In this case, it has to be valid. If a deductive argument's invalid, do we know anything about the truth of the premises? In this particular case, we do not. That's what you would be doing, and it's, again, standard multiple choice for these. You have to just choose A, B, C, or D, whatever you think is the correct answer. All right, and then the third section, the next section of the test that looks like homework number 1 from Unit 4 is a section where I ask you to come up with specific examples of arguments that fit specific parameters. That's an awkward way of describing that, but basically it's going to look like this. I'm going to ask you to write out something like this. Give me an example of a valid deductive argument with a false premise. And then you'll have to provide that example on the test. Maybe I'll ask you to give me an example of an invalid deductive argument with all true premises. And then you have to give me an example. On this homework, I emphasized that you wanted to get original examples. You had to make them up in your head. On the test, I am not going to be doing that. The test, you can use examples we already discussed in class. You can use examples from the test itself if you feel confident that you've correctly answered one of those test questions correctly. You can go back to your memory. They don't have to be original. Because it's a time test, I don't want you to have to rack your brain making up new arguments, basically. And note, there's going to be the same caveat in this section that there was on this homework assignment. If it's not possible to do that, explain why. Well, right there is the same caveat. For any of you who did this homework assignment, you might have noticed that the last thing on here, try to come up with a sound deductive argument that's invalid, is in fact impossible. You can't do that. If an argument is sound, then it can't be invalid. Sound arguments are perfect. Sound arguments have to have not only all true premises, but also valid support. So it's not possible to do that. Maybe there's going to be something like that on the test. Also, maybe not, just to give you a heads up either way. But that's that fourth section of the test. There are only going to be 2 of those I'm asking you to do. And then final section of the test is going to be some short answer questions, only 2 of them. I'm just going to ask you to explain something in a sentence, maybe 2 sentences. So I'm not looking for an essay in response to these questions. I'm not even looking for a paragraph. I'm just looking for a short answer in a sentence or 2 you should be able to do. And again, that could be on anything we've studied in class, like all of our section on intellectual honesty and intellectual dishonesty, what we're learning in class today about productive disagreement, anything like that could be one of these short answer questions. There's also going to be one extra credit question. It'll be like another short answer question, and it'll just be a chance for you to boost your grade. That's everything on the test. Questions, thoughts, concerns about what the test looks like and any of the sections of this test? Feel free to write no in the chat if you don't have any questions. Just looking around, I thought I heard someone. All right, I'm gonna call on Helen, whose hand is up.
Sorry, I asked too many questions, but
No, you
on
don't.
Blackboard, it says like not to leave anything blank because you do get partial credit just for answering the question. Is that true?
Yes. So if you, for instance, left one of these blank up here, you're going to get, I think each one of those questions is worth 3 points on this test. You're going to get 0 out of 3. But if you try to answer it and you get it wrong, you'll get like 2 points out of 3 or 1.5 points out of 3. You'll still get partial credit for trying even if you get it wrong. And the same goes for the multiple choices. Even if you choose the wrong answer, you'll get partial credit at least for trying the multiple choice question. And the same is going to be true for the examples of arguments and the short answer questions. I love giving partial credit, so it's really in your interest. And I mentioned that because I was going to forget to mention that. So thank you, Helen. I encourage you to stop apologizing. It's really helpful when you ask these sorts of questions. I don't want you apologizing about asking questions anymore. It's really helpful. All right, if nobody else has any other sort of questions, why don't we do what Shantae asked and go over some of the homeworks on here, just so we can take a look. I'm gonna get rid of all these markings that I just did. And Helen asks whether the test is automatically graded or we have to wait. So it's sort of a mix. The multiple choice questions on the test are going to be automatically graded, and you're going to be able to see many points you got for those multiple choices right away. Other parts of the test, you're going to have to wait for me to look at and give not only a grade for each, but also feedback. So the test will ultimately be completely graded with feedback after some time. You'll have to wait. My goal in this class, just to give you a heads up, because you have a deadline of Wednesday, my general goal is to try to complete grading for stuff on Thursday between the Wednesday when stuff's due and the Friday we have class the next day. So hopefully I'll get it done on Thursday. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of these. Actually, we already went over those, so that should be fine. Trying to think of some of the interesting, tricky ones on here. So I think arguments 3 and 4 might be worth going over. I'm going to, let's see what I can do here. Just minimize it a little bit so that we only see 3, we only see 4. Let's do 3 for the start here. So argument number 3 says all cats are mammals. All cats have tails. Therefore, all mammals have tails. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller so we can see all of it. Just obsessed with getting things just right, y'all. I love it just right. I don't know why. It's still not just right. Come on. Well, I don't know why I can't make that a little bit smaller, but whatever. All right, so the first premise in this argument, I bet, is pretty easy for y'all to evaluate. All cats are mammals. Even if you didn't know that, you can look that up pretty quickly. And the answer to this one is true. So don't have to spend too much time on that. Second premise on this one, though, I got a lot of people tripped up on this one. Premise 2, all cats have tails. Is that a true sentence? Is that a false sentence? Or is that a questionable sentence? So Shantae's going with false. What do the rest of y'all think for P2? Is P2 true, false, or questionable? This is what we're on right now. So Lamar's going questionable. Ashley's going false. Isabel's going false. We got 3 for false. We got 4 for false, 5 for false. Isabel's giving some reasoning behind her thinking without actually giving an official endorsement of something. Isabel says, I know some cats without tails. And it looks like, and Shantae says some cats can have their tails cut off. And Helen says, well, now I know it's false, but I thought it was questionable. So I think this is why it's worth going over, right? So it's clear that there are at least some cats out there without tails, right? The question is whether, based off of that, we should circle false or we should circle questionable. And let's talk a little bit about why I think you should circle false in this case. I think the correct answer in this case is false. Why do you think I would say it's downright false to say all cats have tails? Even though, if you had to guess, probably more than 99% of the cats on this planet do have tails. It's probably well below 1% of the cat population that don't have tails. And those cats that don't have tails are somewhat rare. Maybe there are cats that are bred to not have tails. Maybe some cats are born without tails. Maybe some cats start life with tails and then have some sort of accident and lose their tail and still go around. Why should we circle false in this case? So Monique says, isn't questionable option more for moral values? That is one of the reasons why we can go with questionable, right? When we're dealing with personal preferences that are purely subjective, or they're moral claims, or they're philosophical claims of the sort that we call non-empirical. It's one category of questionable claims. Another category of questionable claims, just as a reminder, are questionable empirical claims. These are empirical claims where there is a right and wrong answer, but we don't know the answer at this point. Well, in this case, don't we know the answer? Is the sentence, all cats have tails, true objectively or false objectively? Well, as Isabel wrote very nicely in the chat here, we can tell that the statement is wrong, as in false, by proving that not all cats have tails. You know what it takes to prove an all sentence false? You just need one single counterexample. All you need is to point to one cat with a tail And now you know that all claim is false. Not just questionable, downright false. Because the opposite of all is not all, just as Isabel wrote in the chat here. Not all, as in some don't. If at least one cat doesn't have a tail, this all universal 100% claim is false. And that's, as Isabel wrote in the chat very nicely, that's why it's not questionable, because we can actually demonstrate that this claim is false. It's just something to be on the lookout for with all claims. All claims are pretty damn extreme. They're universal. They're 100% claims. And to count an all claim as false, you just need one single counterexample. And Monique says explaining is not allowed on the test. The way I would say it is that I've streamlined the test, so I'm not putting explaining on the test. And for what it's worth, on some of these other arguments, I allowed either false or questionable. Some of these are a little bit on the sort of tricky side, like this premise, for instance. I was okay with this premise one, all skateboarders are extreme, with whether you put false or questionable, because this one maybe straddles the line a little bit. On the test, all of the questions are going to be very clearly in the true camp, very clearly in the false camp, or very clearly in the questionable camp. They're not even going to be questions like all cats, premises like all cats are mammals, because I'm not even going to presume that you know what particular type of animal cats are, whether cats are mammals or reptiles or whatever. I'm going to try to make them like Sesame Street level, really easy, basic claims that are obviously true, obviously false, or pretty clearly belong in the questionable camp. Shantae, if you're asking about premise 2, the correct answer is false. If you meant going back up to this one, on all skateboarders are extreme, premise 2, I would say go with questionable, mainly because the word extreme is itself a subjective thing. I can see the case for false here because, again, we're dealing with an all claim, and all claims are so damn extreme that you might think like there's got to be some skateboarder out there that's just like not extreme at all, just like barely skateboarded in their life and doesn't do any particularly risky or out there extreme stunts, but just sort of skateboards in a very safe, dull way. But the word extreme itself is so subjective, of the sort that Monique was talking about as one type of questionable claim, that subjectivity is what counts as extreme and what doesn't, is probably why I would go with questionable in that circumstance. But remember, ones that are this complicated won't be on the test. Ones on the test are going to look like, I'm trying to think, more like number 5, where it's pretty clear that fish aren't mammals, mammals do not all live in water, those sorts of obvious claims. Even that one, I won't expect you to know what fish are or aren't. All right, now let's go and take a look at the support in this one, because this is another one that tripped some people up. If you know that all cats are mammals, and you know that all cats have tails, and by the way, let's just remind ourselves, when testing for support, we don't care about the truth. So I'm just going to cross out the truth test right now and say it doesn't matter whether premise 2 is false when testing support. It doesn't matter whether premise 1 is true, false, or questionable. When testing support, what I want to do is assume both these premises are true, just for the sake of argument, and see if the conclusion follows from that. Do these premises logically give us enough information to get to the conclusion? And here we know, all cats are mammals and all cats have tails. Does that information in and of itself guarantee that all mammals have tails? Have we proven that every single mammal has a tail? All right, so Isabel says no, Barbara says no, Helen says no. And Isabel, I think, exactly explains, absolutely nails it, why we should say no, that this support is invalid in this case. All we've been told in these premises is information about cat mammals specifically. We know that all cats are mammals, and we know that all cats have tails. So we know that cats have tails, so that's some mammals. But what about the mammals that aren't cats? What about, as Isabel describes it, non-cat mammals? And we don't know whether those exist or don't exist, but they might exist. And if they exist, we don't know the tail status of those non-cats. Those other mammals might all have tails too, or some of them might have tails and some of them might not. Or maybe none of the other mammals out there have tails. Maybe it's only cats. From this information alone, we haven't been told anything about the mammals who aren't cats and whether they have tails or don't. Very nicely done, well explained, nicely and succinctly, Isabel. I really like how succinctly you explained that. All right, and now that we're done our truth test and our support test, we can render our overall verdict. This one I think is a little bit more straightforward, but I did see some people occasionally mess up and do something along the lines of this, where you said some bad stuff up top here, and yet nevertheless circled sound sometimes. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on here. This argument cannot be sound. It can't possibly be sound because it's flawed. We've seen the flaws already, right? The flaws in this argument exist in premise 2 and exist in the support. So this argument has to be unsound. Flawed arguments can't be sound. If you agree with the conclusion, even if you think like, well, on the whole, I kind of like this argument, it doesn't matter. Arguments that have a flaw, and in this case, this argument has 2 flaws, have to be unsound. All right, so that's a nice one, worth discussing. I think the one over here might also be worth discussing as well, argument number 4. This is a similar sort of thing we've got going on with our all cats have tails one. Premise 1 in this argument says, if it snows in Union, then Kane closes. So on this truth test for premise 1, I thought it made sense to circle false. Why do you think I should circle false rather than questionable? This is another case of the debate is probably over false or questionable. I'm sure many of you know that there are some times when it's snowing in Union where Kane as a university was decided to remain open. It was only like light snow, a light dusting. Why would I circle false rather than questionable in this circumstance? Shante said questionable, and by the way, Shante wasn't alone. A bunch of y'all said questionable in this one. I actually saw a bunch of you circle true as well. Maybe you were just assuming for the sake of argument, but no, that doesn't always happen. And so Barbara says, Kane will only close down when the snow is unbearable, right? And as Isabella points out, we get flurries sometimes. That's not unbearable snow. That's when Kane remains open. And Monique really nails, this is the same lesson we were just talking about with that all claims, about all cats having tails before. You can think of an if-then claim in the same exact way as an all claim. If-then means the same thing as every time this one thing happens, then this other thing happens. Every time it snows in Union, then Kane closes. So what do you need to disprove an every time claim? You just need one counterexample, right? You need one time where it snows in Union, but Kane actually remains open. Then that if-then conditional is broken. The connection between snow and closing is broken. That if-then claim is supposed to be a universal claim. So that's why we would go with false and not questionable in that particular circumstance. Another one that seemed a little bit weird is some of you got true for premise 2. It is snowing in Union right now. I don't know when you all were doing the homework, but if it was any time this past week, it was definitely false. It did not snow in Union at all. Union, New Jersey, where the city where Kane is in, at any point during this past week. And so I'm a little confused by what your concern with is about the word it being so definitive, Monique. Do you care to say more a little bit about why that's tricky to you? Because to me, the fact that it's definitive suggests that it's definitively false, right? It is snowing, but you can just look around and be like, no, it's not. It's not snowing in Union. I can see it. Well, right now it's raining in Union, light rain, right? And so that definitive nature means it's either true or false, but in this case, it's actually false. All right, so this is another one where when we turn to test support, on the support side, it might be tricky. You might instinctively want to go with invalid here because our premises are false. But remember, when you do your support test, you don't care about whether the premises are true or false. Your support test has nothing to do with whether the premises are actually true in reality, actually false in reality, or questionable in reality. The support test is more about whether the premises link up to logically lead to this conclusion. If both of these premises were true in some hypothetical world, would they wind up proving this conclusion that Kane's closed right now? So let's talk through this. Let's say you know whenever it snows in Union, Kane closes. And let's say you know it's snowing in Union right now. Does that prove that Kane's closed? Y'all have already started to say in the chat, a bunch of you think the answer is yes. In this case, the answer is yes. This is valid support. If it snows in Union, then Kane closes. It's snowing. What do we know happens when it snows in Union? That means Kane is closed. Premise 1 and premise 2 perfectly link up together to get us to this conclusion. If you like fancy Latin phrases for things, the structure of this argument is called modus ponens. If A, then B. A is happening right now, so B is happening. We know that works out and is logically valid. All right, and now we're ready to do our overall. In this particular case, overall, do we got a flawed argument or do we have a good argument? Sound or unsound? It seems pretty clear. Remember, all you have to do for your overall test is look at what you've already said up above here. If you said nothing but good things, you can circle sound or choose sound. If you circle anything bad, you would circle unsound. And Monique says that she was getting the support mixed up. This is a very common mistake. So I really want to highlight what Monique is saying in the chat here, because I bet a bunch of you wind up doing this when evaluating arguments, and it's something you want to avoid. Monique writes, I was getting the support mixed up. I thought if there was one false premise, then it would be invalid. But that only applies to the overall part. Exactly right. You notice that way of describing things? When we're doing support, I'm covering up. I'm erasing the truth test because support and truth are separate. I don't like to think about the truth when testing for support. Now, when it's the overall time, as Monique wrote, now I can care about the premises being true or false again. And that's why I would circle unsound in this particular case. Yeah, so Shantae asked about the triangle one. That's the trickiest one. I wanted to save that one for the last one. So I'm glad you brought that up, Shantae. This one tripped up a lot of y'all. So I'm excited to discuss this one. So first off, I think the easiest one on here is premise number 1, whether premise 1 is true, false, or questionable. Some triangles are rectangles. Pretty clearly false, right? I don't think I've got to talk about that one too much. Premise number 2 wound up tricking some people, which is interesting. I think this is one of those things that we might not think of too much. Premise number 1 is true. A bunch of y'all put false on this one, but this one is true. There are some rectangles that have equal sides, which makes them squares. A rectangle is just any sort of 4-sided polygon whose interior angles are 90 degrees. A square is all that same stuff, plus all the sides are the same length. So all squares are rectangles. They're just rectangles with one further specification. Not only do squares have to be rectangles, they also have to make sure all the sides are the same length. They're still rectangles though, because rectangles don't specify whether the sides all have to be the same length or not. So in the flip side of this, we could say that not all rectangles are squares, because there are some rectangles out there that are longer than they are tall, but some rectangles are still squares. The rectangles that are as wide as they are tall are squares. Oh, so yeah, so this is just a terminological obnoxiousness. The real way of saying this is not the way your algebra teacher said it, that a square can be a rectangle, but a rectangle can't be a square, is to say that all squares are rectangles. This is the proper way your algebra teacher should say it. All squares are rectangles. Not just, yeah, it was a lie, I'm sorry. And not all rectangles are squares. But embedded within that is the idea that some rectangles are squares.
I'm gonna go back to high
This
school
would
and argue
be,
with my teacher.
please do it. I don't know who's saying that. Is this Helen
It's me,
or
Helen.
Monique? Oh, nice, cool. Sorry, I just didn't see who'd unmuted themselves. Please yell at your algebra teacher for me. Tell them that your logic professor is talking. And this is a question of logic, not math. It's a subset question, right? Squares are a subset of rectangles. Yeah, sorry, I'm not trying to, I'm not, this is bad because we're talking about productive disagreement right now, and it seems like I'm trying to like win a fight against your algebra teacher, but I'm not. I'm not trying to score points here. It's okay, she was rude. Oh, I'm sad. I had such good math teachers in my high school. I think I just got lucky though, because I heard of some horror stories from some of the other math teachers at my high school. But anyway. All right, so going back to our homework assignment here, premise 2 is true. Now, here's one of the trickier things on this whole exact argument. The support test on this particular case is really tricky. I think this is the hardest support test to figure out. First off, remember, it doesn't matter that the first premise is false. Here's where you have to weirdly assume for the sake of argument that that first premise is true. Assume that some triangles are rectangles. That's weird, right? But let's just assume that some of them are, weirdly. Let's also now assume that some rectangles are squares. Does that prove that some triangles have to be squares? And I think a lot of you, maybe even most of you, circled valid for this one, or highlighted valid. Well, the real answer in this case is no, it's invalid. This is not necessarily the case. You could have the triangles that are rectangles all over here in your rectangle place. And then the rectangles that are squares all over here, and there's no crossover among the triangles and the squares. So this is really hard to do without some sort of drawing. So I am going to, for the first time this semester, switch over to this blank whiteboard and try drawing on here for a second. So here's the basic idea of what these sum claims look like. So I'm going to draw a really big old circle right now that represents rectangles. So everything inside here is going to be a rectangle. Let's see if I could just draw little dots. This is terrible. There's supposed to be dots, but like they look like lines. Now it just looks like a wrinkled old, I don't know, raisin or something. Sorry about that. But everything in there is a specific rectangle. Now, what if I tell you that some rectangles are triangles? Here's a way to visually represent that idea. I am going to draw a circle like this, where that circle overlaps the rectangle circle, but also goes outside of it. This is going to be my triangle circle. Now, this is going to be another terrible job I'm probably going to do, but right here, out here, in this part of the red circle, are all the triangles that are not rectangles. But inside here, I'm going to try to like make these overlap. These that are both blue and red, these are rectangles that are triangles. I'm doing a pretty bad job. But this shows that there are some rectangles that are triangles. But there might be some rectangles that aren't triangles. That's just the blue stuff on the left that's not overlapping. And there are some triangles that aren't rectangles. That's the red stuff outside of the blue circle that's just red. The red and blue stuff in the middle, that represents some rectangles are triangles. Or I guess it's some triangles are rectangles. I forget how it's written. So right now, what we've established from this is some triangles are rectangles. This is essentially what premise 1 looks like. Remember, that's premise 1. Now, the second premise, just as a reminder, is going to be, let me switch colors here. I'll go to green. The second premise, just as a reminder, is some rectangles are square. Oh, that's a terrible color. Yeah, maybe I can change it. Let's see. Maybe I'll go with purple. Ugh. Can I just write over it? That is a little bit better. But see, now that if I write it here, it's just going to cover it up. I'm going to write it over here. Some rectangles are squares. Sorry, I just like things to be pretty, and that green was not pretty to me. All right, now, here's how I could draw the square circle in this particular diagram. Yeah, as Monique says in the chat here, it's like a flag with a triangle, right? You're just trying to picture it, you guess, right? So all I have to do is make sure my purple circle that's going to represent our squares here overlaps the rectangle circle in some place. There are a few different places I could put it, but one place I could draw it is over here, so that it overlaps the rectangle circle a little bit, but doesn't overlap the triangle circle at all. This could be right here, my square circle. It's weird that I'm doing circles for all of these and none of these shapes are circular, I'm sorry, but hopefully you get what I'm going with here. And here, again, are all the squares that aren't rectangles in this portion of this purple circle. But right here, I guess there's only one of them, is the one rectangle that is a square. There is some overlap. What I have just done is drawn a diagram of a world where some squares are rectangles and some triangles are rectangles, but there's no overlap between squares and triangles. So there aren't any squares that are triangles in this imaginary world. It's very weird to talk about this because in actuality, we know the right answer about whether triangles are squares or not, whether some or none or all squares are triangles. The correct answer, of course, is that no triangles are squares. But when we're testing support the way we're doing right now, this entire support test is completely imaginary. We're just imagining a world and what could be true. There are other places we could have drawn our circle. We could have drawn our square circle so that there is an overlap of all three. We could have drawn our circle so that triangles are a complete subset of squares. Or we could have drawn our circle where squares are a subset of triangles. All of those are possible. I wonder if I can undo what I just did. Probably not. Let me see. No, at least Control Z doesn't work. Oh well. But I have drawn at least one possibility, the first thing that I drew, that shows that these premises do not have to get to this conclusion. And if they don't have to reach that conclusion, that's when we have invalid support. So Isabel says if the support says some and all are, is that statement still true? So I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, Isabel. Maybe you can unmute yourself, or you can write more in the chat to clarify. If it was some squares are rectangles, for example, all right, and all squares are rectangles, is the statement that some are true? Boy, I'm still confused, Isabel, as to what you're asking. Could you flesh out the last question? Is the statement that some what are what true? Go ahead, Helen, unmute yourself while Isabel.
So what I think she's trying to
finishes writing.
say is that even though we know that all like squares are rectangles, if the statement were to say some squares are rectangles.
I'm back. Can you hear me? I think I just had to reconnect.
Do you hear what I was saying?
I did hear what you were saying, Helen. Sorry, I'm going to start recording again. So now you heard Helen did a great job of explaining what's going on. And I now, because of Helen's explanation, understand what Isabel's asking. So in reality, we know the statement all squares are rectangles is true, right? That seems to be the starting point for what Isabel's talking about. Now, one thing we can wonder is whether the following claim is true. Some squares are rectangles. Would you think that that sentence is true, or would you say that sentence is false? That's a tricky question, right? Because the word some in this particular context means different things to different people. Some people interpret the word some the following way. Some people think some means some, but not all. And if that's what you mean when you say some squares are rectangles, then this particular claim, some squares are rectangles, is false, right? Because it's not some but not all squares that are rectangles. It's downright all squares that are rectangles. Now, the way that traditionally people in logic interpret this some claim is as follows. They will interpret this some claim as at least one and possibly more squares are rectangles. Yeah, as Monique says, there's at least a possibility, right? There's at least one actual, right? Possibly more than one. And by that particular standard, in this context, this claim would be true. Oh, darn, I did the green again. Hopefully you can see that that's green. It's just a terrible green. Sorry, everybody. So the way that people in philosophy who study logic interpret some claims traditionally is this one. That's the traditional way that people in philosophy interpret some. And it's just being slightly more careful, because technically, when somebody says some, they don't always try to exclude the possibility of all, right? But in this particular case, it really depends on the context. You'd want to ask somebody when they make a some claim, what exactly did they mean? because you could get some more info from them if they mean by some but not all. I think if you want to be hyper careful, Isabel, you would interpret it in the right way, the right side way, not the left side way. I didn't mean the correct way. The way that means at least one and possibly more. All right, so I think at this particular point, let me go back to our slides here. That's a lot more on, where did it go? On this argument. The invalid on this one was the trickiest bit. Just as a reminder, all of us, now that we're done our support test, we can start with our overall test. Should we circle sound or unsound at this point? Everybody should just shout it in the chat. Shantae's going with unsound. How about the rest of y'all? Overall, are we going sound or unsound? All right. Hopefully you're starting to feel that the overall test is getting easier and easier. The more you recognize that sound just means perfect and unsound means flawed. It's very clear in this particular case, we've got 2 flaws in this argument. And 2 flaws is enough to make an argument unsound. Even 1 flaw is enough to make it unsound. So, awesome. All right, so one thing I also want to remind you, that whole thing I was doing with like circling stuff to try to figure stuff out is explained a little bit in one of your readings from earlier in the semester. I think this was a Unit 3 or Unit 4 reading, I forget now. But this is basically drawing diagrams to test for support. This last page of this reading titled Arguments talks about 3 ways to just focus on the support of an argument. And my general method is to imagine a world where the premises are true and see if the conclusion follows. But another method is to not only imagine that world, but create a map of what the world would look like if those premises were true. And that diagram can help visualize, if you're more of a spatial thinker, what that world would look like. Cool. All right, so maybe it might be worth talking about 1 or 2 of these. We already talked about argument number 9 and 10 in the multiple choice. Let's see. Some trickier ones on here specifically are the ones where the answer is I'm not sure. So we already did that for number 10. That's an I'm not sure. But number 13 is also an I'm not sure. If all you know is that a deductive argument's valid, that means it's only passed the support test. And if you ever forget, you can always just scroll back up and say like, wait, what's valid about? Oh, valid's about support, not overall, just support. So valid means we've got good support. From that, and from that alone, we don't know whether the argument's sound or unsound. To figure out whether the argument's sound or unsound, we have to also check the truth of the premises, because sound means everything's right. If we've got one thing right, it's not clear whether we've got both of our things right, right? Good arguments pass both of our tests, truth and support. But an argument that's valid could be sound if it has all true premises, or could be unsound if it has a false premise. So the correct answer for that one is C. And I think another ones on here, number 12 and 16, I think were similarly tricky for the same particular type of reason. When you only know the truth of the conclusion, you don't know much else about the argument because you don't know anything about the premises. So you don't know whether the premises validly support the conclusion by giving you enough information to get there. You don't know whether the premises are invalid and don't give you enough information to get there. The correct answer for that one is C. And the same thing is true for number 16 in reverse. If you know the conclusion's false, you still don't know anything about the premises in the argument, and you don't know whether the premises link up to get you to the conclusion or not. You might feel more compelled to think that this has to be invalid, but remember, the support test, all about valid and invalid, has nothing to do with truth, has nothing to do with whether the premises are true, false, or questionable, and also nothing to do with whether the conclusion is true, false, or questionable. So just an important thing to remind yourself of. All right. And then we already went over, I thought, the trickiest one on here, number 20, as our examples go. Argument number 20 is impossible to create. You can't create a sound deductive argument that's invalid, because sound means perfect and invalid means flawed support. So you'd have a perfect but flawed argument. That's not possible. Perfection means no flaws. Have a flawless, flawed argument. All right, the other ones I'll just note real quickly is that argument number 19 and argument number 17, you could have written the same exact argument twice, because in both cases it was asking you to come up with a valid argument. And in the first case, it was asking you to have an argument with a false premise. Well, what do we know? If a valid argument has a false premise, we know it's got to be unsound, because that false premise makes it flawed. That false premise is what makes that argument unsound. So you could have done the same exact argument for number 17 and 19, and both would have worked. I think that's everything related to the homework. This is, I think, one of the better things you can do in preparation for the test. Look over your homework, look over my feedback. You can also look over the Unit 3 participation activity that you did, and look over the answer sheet to the Unit 3 participation activity, which is posted in Unit 3. And that will go a long way towards you reviewing for this test, since the test is, by and large, a combo of the Unit 3 participation activity and the homework from Unit 4. There's also a little bit of some short answer questions, but that's prepping just by like remembering what we've studied in all of these units. Any other questions, thoughts, concerns about the test before we dive into some conversation about productive disagreement? Feel free to write no in the chat if you don't have questions. Feel free to write, yeah, I got questions in the chat if you do have questions. Feel free to hit that raise hand button. Got a bunch of no's. All right. Cool. So we're going to do it. We're going to switch over to start talking about some productive disagreements. And, I've got to switch my slides here to the top so we can do it. All right. So we're going to be focusing on this particular reading for class this week. I'm betting many of you have not done it yet. It is reading number 6. Let's see, I can actually switch to it. Give me a second. There we go. Called How to Disagree by Paul Graham. It's available in this week's folder. I highly recommend checking it out. It's super short, super productive. So essentially, Paul Graham, the author of this article, thinks of disagreeing with each other in a variety of different levels. He calls this the hierarchy of disagreement, and he thinks it goes from, on this particular pyramid scale, from at the very bottom, the least productive way to disagree with people, name calling, ad hominem responding to tone, towards the very top being very productive and coming up with good ways, effective ways that are productive to disagree with people. And I want to think just in general about what it is we do when we disagree, how it is we go about disagreeing with people, and what the sort of goal is. So I'm just going to ask you right now, what is your goal when you're in a disagreement with somebody? When you want to point out that you disagree with somebody else, what are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to accomplish when you point out you disagree with someone? By the way, the answer might not be the same for all of us. So I'm going to start with Lamar, who's got his hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
when I disagree with somebody, um, I really try my hardest not to necessarily poke holes in their argument first. I just try to give them my viewpoint as to why I disagree. So it's more of this is what I think rather than what you think is wrong.
Okay. So you're less focused on trying to poke holes in their reasoning or argument. You're more just saying, here are my reasons why I'm on the other side of this particular topic. Okay. So you might be doing what we call counter arguing. Here's my arguments for why. I like that. So Helen in the chat writes, honestly, sometimes it's an I'm right, you're wrong sort of situation. So in that case, your goal might be to prove that that person's wrong, right? To prove that you're right, to prove that they're wrong. Seems like Shantae's sort of on the same level of this, saying your goal is to change that other person's mind on the topic, or maybe at least give them another perspective, another point of view to look at. So those are like one's just like a weaker version of the other. Like the ultimate goal of changing someone's mind is to switch them, right? To get them to go from their belief to your belief, right? Or give them your perspective at least. But Helen follows up what she wrote before when it was the I'm right, you're wrong approach, and says, most of the time, it's just giving my input and listening to what they have to say because I can learn from that. So we've heard from, it sounds like 3 at this particular point, and we've heard a bunch of different goals. Like Helen gave us 2 different reasons to disagree. Shantae gave us 2 different reasons to disagree. Even Lamar, in his short thing that he said, gave us a few different reasons. So you can tell already there are some varieties of disagreements. So I want to talk about what qualifies as a productive disagreement versus an unproductive disagreement. And the way I'm going to frame it in this class is in terms of what's intellectually productive. Because this is a class that is about critical thinking. This is an academic pursuit that we are in. We are trying to, in some ways, advance ourselves intellectually in this particular class. We're going to try to focus on the goal of being intellectually productive. And I want to talk now about the ways in which what some of y'all were saying are not that productive, and the ways in which some of the other things y'all were saying are intellectually productive. And that's the whole goal of what we're going to be doing for the next part of class. So let's talk about some less intellectually productive goals at first. So the most common way that I think people disagree is in the form of a debate, right? Some of you might have even watched the presidential debate that happened earlier this week. It's very clear that in a debate, you're framing everything in terms of a competition. It's you versus me. It's a possible winner and a possible loser. And you want to be on the winning side, and you don't want to be on the losing side. And it's a zero-sum competition where one side wins and the other side loses. And Shantae says there was not a debate, it was a mess. Well, I mean, it depends on what you thought was the goal. But I would say if your goal was to learn something in particular about an intellectually productive, like they were genuinely trying to figure something out, that was a completely unproductive debate. But it's very clear both of them were trying to win a debate. I think all political debates are competitive in this sense. I find those sorts of competition-style debates, competition-style disagreements, I find them personally demoralizing. This idea that you're just trying to win kind of thinks that it reminds me a little bit of what Shantae was saying in the first part of her response and what Helen was saying in her first response in the chat, right? When you're trying to win a disagreement, you're basically trying to say, hey, I'm right, you're wrong. I'm on the right side, I'm the winner. You're on the wrong side, you're the loser. Or if you're what Shantae's saying, you're saying like, hey, my side's the right side, so you have to change your mind on this topic. So I'm the winner in this. You're the one who's losing. You're the one who has to admit that you're losing and change your mind. I've got to convince you. I've got to beat you. I've got to get you on this particular side. So that's one sort of intellectually productive goal that's not so great it's not that productive, right? And Onel says that you agree to the sentiment that it's unproductive, right? In this particular case, it might be productive if you care about winning and losing, if your goal is winning, but it's not intellectually productive. People are less likely to learn. People are less likely to grow if that is your goal, right? Because in this case, it really is a zero-sum competition. And what happens based off of human psychology is both sides trying to win a debate oftentimes just dig further in. They dig their heels in this battle and are less likely to, quote unquote, admit defeat. And I don't think of admitting defeat as a bad thing as long as it's reframed outside of a competition. Because what losing a debate is, in this sort of context, is just changing your mind, is actually learning, is actually growing, is actually going from thinking something that might not be correct to thinking something that is correct. That's a productive possibility. That's productive growth. Monique writes in the chat, I feel like when you start attacking someone's character or personal appearance, then it kind of invalidates the original argument someone's trying to make. Yeah, and if you see, going back to this first slide here, what's the lowest form of disagreement on here? Name calling, attacking somebody, ad hominem. Those are our lowest ones. So absolutely. And Onel writes in the chat, nobody changes their mind by attacking them or humiliating the other. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it happens sometimes, but I'm with you in spirit, Onel, that by and large, it's harder to get people to change their minds through an attack or humiliation, through those sorts of ad hominem approaches. And remember, I don't even think that's an appropriate goal in the first place. I don't think that should be your goal when you disagree anyway. I think, by and large, we should avoid thinking of disagreements as competitions. I think, by and large, you should not think that there has to be a winner and a loser, and somebody's taking score, somebody's keeping score, and you've got to score points in the debate. You've got to show that you know what you're talking about, and the other person doesn't know what they're talking about. That is not an effective way to disagree. And by the way, it's sort of related to just that idea that like you want to seem smart, right? You want to come off as smarter than your opponent, that you're on the right side and they're on the wrong side, which makes you smart and it makes them dumb, right? Those are not intellectually productive goals. By the way, does this relate to anything we've been talking about this semester? Does the idea that you put as your top goal, winning and seeming smart, as a bad thing remind you of anything we've discussed in class so far? What is the sort of approach where you use arguments just to win versus something else or seem smart? Facundo nails it in the chat here. Excellent. That's intellectual dishonesty, right? Or just to frame it one step back, this is thinking of disagreements as a persuasion game, as a rhetoric game, where your goal is to try to convince and persuade others, or to use slightly more morally tinged terms, your goal is to manipulate others to change their mind, to trick others into changing their mind. Once you put these goals at the top, I got to win this debate, I got to seem smart, and you don't care about the other thing, the intellectually honest thing, which is the truth and learning, you are headed down the path of intellectual dishonesty. So the more intellectually honest approach then would be, we should try to learn. And my favorite thing in this particular goal is that both of us together, when we disagree with each other, can have the same exact goal of trying to figure out whether this argument shows the conclusion is true. So let me try finally reference the argument that's at the top of this. Let's imagine that I come in front of class and I present this argument to you. And the argument is as follows. Premise 1, it's morally wrong to cause animal suffering. Premise 2, buying meat from large corporations causes animal suffering. Conclusion, it's morally wrong to buy meat from large corporations. Let's say I totally believe this argument. I am committed to this conclusion. And let's say you disagree with this argument. Specifically, you disagree with the conclusion. You think there's nothing morally wrong with buying meat and eating meat that is sold by large corporations. We can both still together have the same productive goal of trying to learn whether this is a good argument or a bad argument. I might come to this conversation thinking that this is a good argument. You might come to this conversation thinking this is a bad argument. But together, we're both trying to figure out whether it's a good argument or a bad argument. We can try to learn together. And it's going to be helpful for both of us to hear your perspective that's critical of this argument and to hear my perspective that's not critical but supportive of this argument. So that's the idea of an intellectually productive disagreement. And now let's put that specifically within the context of this hierarchy right here. So what I'm going to do right now is imagine some fictional scenario where a bunch of different random people wind up putting forward a disagreement to that you see in front of us right now. And in this fictional scenario, let's say that I've invited my colleague, Dr. Chapman, to provide this argument. So now it's no longer me in this hypothetical that's providing this argument, but now it's like a guest speaker that I brought in to participate in class. And let's say that Dr. Chapman spends 10 minutes outlining her argument for why it is she thinks it's morally wrong to buy meat from large corporations. She spends like 3 or 4 minutes explaining premise 1. She spends another 3 or 4 minutes explaining premise 2. And then she wraps it all up by explaining why those premises get us to the conclusion that it's morally wrong to buy meat from large corporations. Now let's say at the end of her 10-minute presentation, Dr. Chapman says, all right, the floor is open. It's question and answer time. Who would like to say something? Who would like to respond to the argument that I just put forward? Let's say a student raises their hand and says the following. Hi, Dr. Chapman. Thanks for your talk. I noticed that you sound a lot like a stupid tree-hugging hippie. Are you a dumb hippie? What do you think about that as a form of disagreement? Is that productive? Is that not so productive? What do you all think? So Shanae's going with bad. Corey says it's name calling. Shanae's not into it. Helen says it's rude. Got a bunch of no's and some nahs. Yeah, I think this is pretty clearly name calling, right? We're at the lowest end of our hierarchy of disagreement, right? Let's talk about why exactly this is so bad. Why is this unproductive? So Helen mentioned one thing, it's rude. Why else is this unproductive? Think about it specifically if your goal is to learn. Why is this not a good way of going about it? Shanae, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Well, there's not any, like, she didn't say any evidence. She didn't, like, contradict her. All she did was name call. It wasn't really a good argument from the jump. Like, if she would have explained why she think it is, or, you know, like, just provide any information on it, then it would have been good. But because she just name called, it's a bad argument.
Excellently, very well said, Shanae. She's not talking about this argument at all. She's not presenting evidence. She's not presenting counter evidence. She's not even discussing the argument. Corey writes in the chat that she's talking about something completely unrelated to the topic. That's a really big issue with this type of thing. Once you start criticizing Dr. Chapman, you've turned the attention away from the argument and towards Dr. Chapman. And maybe you want to have a debate about Dr. Chapman. Maybe you want to have a disagreement about that. But if you really care about learning about this argument, talking about Dr. Chapman is not going to help you learn about this argument. So excellent, really well said. I love it. And Facundo says that this doesn't intellectually move the conversation forward. In fact, it moves the conversation sideward, right? It moves the conversation to something different, Now suddenly we've got to focus on Dr. Chapman and whether she really is a hippie, or whether she really is dumb or not, right? So very bad move. And I'm sure you've seen this in practice, right? People sometimes do this, and it's totally unproductive. So awesome. Let's start talking about another person who raises their hand and provides the following comment after Dr. Chapman's nice 10-minute speech outlining her argument for why it's morally wrong to buy meat. Let's say another student raises their hand and says, "Thanks, Dr. Chapman. You're obviously an animal lover. You've got vegan power stickers on your laptop. You always talk about your pet bunnies. So aren't you biased? Why should we listen to someone who's so biased in favor of animals?" What do you think about this as a move in a disagreement? Do you think this one is intellectually productive? Is it not intellectually productive? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it just as bad as what we were just doing? All right, so Corey's saying it's a viable disagreement. Shanae says it's good. So I got 2 votes for, or at least on the path of better at this point. Interesting. Isabel says there's something that could be worded better. And second Isabel, with an LE at the end of her first name, says, it's not very good. And Helen agrees that it's not very good. Onel says it's a little better, but it's still not up to refuting the point. Corey says the person backs it up with support, but still could be more respectful, I guess. Yeah, so let's think a little bit about this, right? This does feel better in some way, but I don't think it's much better, right? As Isabel writes here, a biased person can make a good argument. So just to clarify where we're at in our disagreement right now we're at the ad hominem stage. We are just one level up from name calling, right? Essentially what you're doing is attacking Dr. Chapman's character. You're attacking her authority. You're saying, we shouldn't listen to Dr. Chapman. She's biased. She's got a pro-animal bias. So that's why she's giving this argument. Well, it sounds like that might be relevant. You are still not talking about the argument. Isabel, I think, addressed this pretty clearly in this comment. This doesn't address the argument at all. It just hints at the source of the argument might be not a reliable source. And if we go back to the comment Isabel made 2 comments ago, Isabel wrote, the problem is a biased person can make a good argument. Just because she's biased doesn't mean this argument is bad. She might have a very good argument. Biased sources are only bad to trust if they're not backing up what they're saying with evidence. If they're just saying, hey, trust me, I'm saying it, so it must be true, then you can call them out on bias. We'll be learning about this later in class. These are arguments from authority. But if somebody's presenting an argument, that argument can exist independently of whether that person giving the argument is biased or not. The person making the argument is completely separate from the argument itself. Notice, by the way, most of you have no idea who Dr. Chapman actually is. I on purpose created a fictional, well, she's actually real. She is somebody I work with. But I created this made up example of Dr. Presenting because you actually don't know what she's like. You don't know her actual characteristics, but you do know her argument. You see her argument right at the top of the screen. And that argument is good or bad, completely separate from Dr. Chapman. All right, so Isabel says, in this case, it doesn't even seem like bias. It's not that surprising to have someone who believes something outwardly supporting that thing. This is another really good way of thinking about this, right? The sort of person who might really be into animals and have a vegan power sticker might be the sort of person who was originally convinced by this argument you see in front of you. And so she only became, quote unquote, biased after reviewing the evidence, right? And so everybody's biased in that sort of vague way, but it's such a weak understanding of bias. It just means I've now committed myself to the conclusion that the evidence has led me toward. But you can't dismiss somebody who's drawn a conclusion from the relevant evidence. that doesn't make them biased. Perhaps that makes them very reasonable. That makes them reasonable that the evidence has led them to their particular thinking. So excellent further analysis there, Isabel, on that one. All right, so by the way, that you do see this happening all the time, right? Go back to a Trump versus Biden debate, for instance. They're constantly talking about bias or trying to attack each other's credibility in this sort of way. It's just not intellectually productive, though, if you're concerned, say, about, I don't know, the policies of those particular candidates. Isabel D in the chat writes, it's also a weird thing to have bias about. Just because someone buys meat doesn't mean they don't love animals. Yeah, so I mean, that's another sort of thing. In this particular case, it might not even line up. And Isabel Z says, like, oh, you're arguing we need to wear clothes outside, but I can't help but notice you're wearing clothes outside. Curious. Sounds like somebody's pre-committed to their conclusion without really considering the alternatives. Yeah, that feels like a really nice analogy to sort of explain why this type of criticism is not so productive. Excellent. All right, so let's move on to another level on this one. Let's say after Dr. Chapman's 10-minute presentation, another student raises his hand and says, thanks for sharing, Dr. Chapman. You're an English professor, right? You're not an animal ethics professor. So why should we listen to you when you're not an expert on animals? You're not an expert on animal ethics. What do you think about this move? Shanae and Isabel instantly, no, not into it. You think it's better, worse, the same as the types of disagreements we've already been dealing with? Shanae's going with worse. Isabel writes in the chat, someone who isn't an official expert on something can still make an argument. Isabel also says, I feel like it's worse. Isabel Z says it's marginally better because it's at least a fair thing to bring up. Isabel D says they never claimed to be an expert. Yeah, so I think there's something important about this. I would actually put this on the same exact level. I think this is still ad hominem. Rather than attacking Dr. Chapman for being biased, you're attacking her for not being an authority, for not knowing her stuff on this particular issue. But as Isabel Z in the chat just wrote, having a degree does not mean you're not an expert, right? You could be an expert and well-researched on something, even if you don't have a formal education on it, right? And as Isabel asks, how do you even define expert? Really good question. We'll be discussing expertise when we discuss arguments from authority later on in this particular course. And as Isabel D writes, the flip side is true. You could get a degree and still not be an expert, right? Maybe you just barely passed your classes, or you paid somebody off or something like that. So I think the key flaw is still the same. We are still talking about Dr. Chapman, and we're not talking about the argument, right? This is still focused on the wrong thing. As long as you focus on Dr. Chapman and not on the argument in front of us, you are not providing a productive move in an intellectual disagreement where we're trying to learn. So that's an important point. Even though we might think, in general, we might not want to fully trust Dr. Chapman if she's just saying stuff to say stuff, as long as she's presenting an argument and we want to figure out whether this argument's good or bad, all we have to do is look at her argument. And we can basically forget about Dr. Chapman herself, her bias, her expertise, anything. It doesn't matter. All right, next step in this, let's say after Dr. Chapman presents this whole interesting presentation, a student raises her hand and says, thanks, Dr. Chapman. I appreciate what you said, but I'm pretty sure I saw you eating a bacon and cheddar burger at Smashburger yesterday. So, like, why should we listen to you when you don't even practice what you preach? What do y'all think about this as a move? Is that a good burn? Has our student effectively disagreed with Dr. Chapman? Ooh, Shantae's like, I'm guessing you meant to write good, unless you really mean that's a goof. Probably not. Isabel Z says, I mean, it's a good burn, but doesn't mean anything. That's interesting. I would like you to unpack what you're saying there, Isabel, because I feel like I like what you're saying there, right? And Helen's saying, yeah, she did get caught, right? She's caught red-handed here, right? She's caught bacon and cheddar burger handed, right? Isabel D says that's good, but they should probably be more than pretty sure. Interesting, yeah. So let's think a little bit about this. Isabel Z is trying to follow a little bit more about this and writes, you can do something contradictory to your argument and still make a good argument. I love this. I think this is exactly right. Very well written, Isabel. So this, for what it's worth, is still at the damn ad hominem level. We are still focused on Dr. Chapman. And we are focused on whether Dr. Chapman believes this argument or doesn't believe this argument. We are still not focused on the argument itself. You know whether this is a good argument or bad? What's relevant? Not whether Dr. Chapman thinks it's a good or a bad argument. This is a good or bad argument completely separate from whether Dr. Chapman practices what she preaches, whether she falls short of her standards or doesn't, right? Yeah, our double Isabels are super on point today. Yeah, they're so on point and so on top of it that I'm having trouble saying which Isabel gets credit for which. I'm trying to say Isabel D and Isabel Z to reference their last names, but even D and Z sound similar enough that you might not hear my distinction that I'm trying to draw here. If only there were a way to verbally say the spelling difference between our two Isabels, but I guess not. But back to this one. This is the one that I think trips up a lot of people because I feel like people really want to dig in and say there's something good going on here. There's something relevant. And here's what I want to say to those people who think that you feel something good about this. Yeah, there is a relevant criticism of Dr. Chapman. You have caught Dr. Chapman being a hypocrite. And a hypocrisy, you might think in general, is bad. So it might be a legitimate criticism of Dr. Chapman to say she is a hypocrite. She's saying one thing and doing another. That might be a legitimate criticism. While all that is true, that criticism of Dr. Chapman is not a criticism of this argument. This argument can still be good, even if Dr. Chapman is a hypocrite, even if Dr. Chapman has a character flaw of some sort, right? Yeah, so both of our Isabels have written nice things in the chat here. Isabel Z wrote like, oh, you're arguing we should have better public transit, yet you didn't take the bus to class, right? Okay, great. Well, maybe it's because you want better public transit. Isabel D writes, the argument also says it's morally wrong, but doesn't specifically say she doesn't support it, right? I could imagine somebody saying, I think it's wrong to buy meat, but I still do it now and then. I'm weak-willed or something like that. I see this all the time with people who are smokers, right? The most virulent anti-smoking arguments I've ever heard have come from people who smoke, who are actively smoking while they're telling me, none of you should ever smoke. Smoking's terrible. None of us should smoke. It is horrible for you. While they're lighting a cigarette with their already lit cigarettes to continue smoking. That sort of thing is just somebody who has a high standard for themselves, there they might be falling short of that standard. That's maybe a criticism of that person, but it's certainly not a criticism of their argument. Their argument might totally make sense and worth looking at. All right, so I think we're done with this level of disagreement for now. Let's move on to a higher level. Hopefully, we'll find out. All right, in this particular point, let's say Dr. Chapman spends 10 minutes presenting, and then the student raises their hand and says, thank you so much, Dr. Chapman. I think my issue with vegetarians like you is that you just sound so smug. Like, you all seem to think you're so much better than the rest of us. Why are you being so condescending? All right, so Shantae and Isabella, before I even finished, we're saying no to this. Corey's on a definite no on this one. Let's talk about why. What do you not like about this? First off, what level do you think we're at? And second off, why do you think this isn't a great move in a disagreement? So Isabel D says it's rude. Certainly rude, right? It feels a lot like name calling again, right? Maybe we're back to name calling a little bit. bit. But as Helen and Isabel D and Corey all confirm, now we're at the level of responding to tone, right? It's very clear that our student who disagrees with Dr. Chapman is focused on Dr. Chapman's tone, how she sounds while making her argument, how she seems condescending when making her argument, right? That's clearly focused on the tone. Well, at least we're now almost focused on the argument, but now we're focused not on what the argument says, we're focused on how Dr. Chapman said the argument. So that's still not about the argument, right? That's still not focused on whether the premises are true, whether the premises support the conclusion. It's focused on how someone says something, not what they're saying. And Isabel D says that we feel like we're further away from the arguments. Isabel Z says responding to tone at least can be helpful to the person making an argument as something to consider for the future, but it's still not actually about the argument. And I agree with this, but notice how in the same way, pointing out Dr. Chapman's a hypocrite might help Dr. Chapman be less of a hypocrite in the future. Pointing out that her tone isn't great and maybe she should work on that is still not about the argument. It might be helpful for Dr. Chapman to know, but it's not helpful to figure out whether this is a good or a bad argument. So very well written, Isabel. Awesome. So tone, again, not about the argument. You see how in these first three levels, you're just not talking about the argument. When you're name calling, attacking the characteristics of a person, you're responding to the tone in which somebody talks, you're not focused on the argument. That's why these are the worst three levels of disagreement. All right, let's now move on to this next one. Oops, I guess I already, I told you what it is, so who cares? I'll just show you that this is our contradiction level. Imagine after 10 minutes of speaking, a student stands up in the back, raises his hand and says, "Hi, Dr. Chapman, thanks for presenting. I just want to point out that I disagree with you. I think it's morally okay to buy and eat meat." And that's it. What do you think about this student's attempt to disagree? Nice. Shantae freaking nails this in 4 words. Okay, but like, why? And as Barbara follows up, there's no reasoning here, right? This is the contradiction level. All you're doing is saying, I disagree. Now, the nice thing about this is that we're finally talking about some part of the argument. The conclusion is part of the argument, right? And as Onel mentions, a lot better than all the insults, right? Notice we're not insulting Dr. Chapman anymore. We're not even talking about Dr. Chapman anymore. We're talking about the conclusion of the argument. We're finally away from Dr. Chapman. But here's the problem that Shantae and Barbara were pointing out. We have not actually engaged with the argument part of this argument. What's the argument part of an argument? It's the evidence, right? The evidence is where all the action happens in an argument. We didn't just put forward, Dr. Chapman didn't just put forward a sentence, one claim as a conclusion, and not defend it. Because if that's all she did, maybe you could say like, well, I disagree. And you could start a conversation about the conclusion and only the conclusion. But once Dr. Chapman presents an argument, you want to engage with the argument itself, right? Yeah, so this is at least the first one that's like at the level of respectful, or at least what I would call minimally respectful. But even still, it feels a little rude. Because imagine Dr. Chapman talks for 10 minutes, and then this student in the back raises his hand and says, "Hey, just want to point out I disagree. I don't think your conclusion is right. Your turn." Like, what do you think Dr. Chapman's supposed to say in response to that? Dr. Chapman's like, "Oh, okay, noted, thank you. Maybe we can take a poll of all of you?" Yeah, as Barbara writes here, like, just like, okay, moving on, let's go to someone else, right? There's nothing to like grab onto to actually discuss. So this is going back to Facundo's words that Facundo keeps saying in here. It's not moving the conversation forward, right? What you want to do to be intellectually productive is give your person you're talking to something to respond to. And that's nothing to respond to at this point. All right, next one. 10 minutes go by. Dr. Chapman has presented very nicely for 10 minutes, and then the student raises their hands to in the middle of the room and says, "Thanks for your talk, Dr. Chapman. I just like to tell you why I think it's okay to eat meat. I think humans have always eaten meat. So they're like, just look at our teeth. Our incisors are meant to tear through flesh. They're designed like that. What do you think about this as a move in a disagreement?" All right, so Shanae's going with it's better. We're providing information, right? We're answering what Shantae and Barbara were saying, like, okay, but why, right? Now we're at least finding out why this student disagrees with Dr. Chapman, right? So this is a little bit better. I like this. What level do you think we're at this particular point? Do you think we're all the way at the top? Do you think we're still at contradiction? What do you think we're at? So we're at counter argument. Okay, totally agree. I think we are at counter argument. Side point, I really hope you like all of the color coding that I'm doing on these slides. I'm just a big sucker for color coding. So anyway, not a big deal. Thank you, Isabel. It is fancy. But Isabel also writes in the chat, beyond just complimenting my fanciness and color choice, but just because you have the ability to do something doesn't mean that it's morally right. So now Isabel's actually getting into the nitty-gritty of this. So here's what a counter argument is. Not only do you contradict somebody by saying I disagree with your conclusion, you're also presenting an argument, right? But here's the problem. Here's what happens in a counter argument. You're presenting your own argument. You're not presenting you're not talking about Dr. Chapman's argument. So essentially, I think this is what's going on in the counter argument. Dr. Chapman gives an argument, spends 10 minutes talking about it, and then you raise your hand and you say, okay, your argument's fine and all, but like, can we talk about my argument? I've got my argument and I want to talk about my reasons. Let's talk about my argument now. Sure, it's an argument that's on the same topic, but isn't that still a change of subjects? You're not talking about Dr. Chapman's argument. And the goal of this is to figure out whether Dr. Chapman's argument is good or bad. And you're just swamping Dr. Chapman's argument by just ignoring it, ignoring the premises entirely. You basically didn't have to listen to Dr. Chapman at all to make this comment. So there's still something a little bit rude about this. Dr. Chapman, if you say this, might be like, oh, okay, let's talk about your argument now, I guess. There's something to respond to, but you're not responding to actually what was said. This is a failure to listen. You're not listening close enough to what's going on in this particular argument. All right, I think we got one more set of these. Our final student, after Dr. Chapman presents for 10 minutes, raises her hand and says, "Thank you, Dr. Chapman. You know, I'm interested in your second premise about how buying meat causes animals to suffer. I'm not sure I agree with that point. I feel like it's the corporations who are causing all the suffering, not me. So how does a purchase cause suffering? What do y'all think about this particular move?" Shanae says, okay, now this is refutation, and you've raised your hand. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
So I think it's refutation because not only did she explain, she also told her why she found it was a mistake as to why she disagreed with hers, and then she also put her point into the information.
Very well said, Shanae. I love it. She is, in this particular case, focusing on Dr. Chapman's argument and attempting to refute a part of the argument, right? And as Corey says, she's using quotes in the sense that she's saying, I'd like to talk about your second premise, right? I want to focus on one of your premises. I think that premise is at least questionable, maybe downright false. Let me give you my reasons why I think that. Now you tell me why you think I'm right or wrong about this, right? That's refutation. That is the apex. That is the top of the top goal. We want refutation. And the way you refute an argument? Truth and support. Do you know how you try to refute an argument? It's our mantra in this class. You look at the truth of the premises, and say whether you agree or disagree with the premises. Maybe premise 1 is questionable. Maybe premise 2 is questionable. Maybe premise 2 is downright false. Or you say, you know what? I agree with all of your premises. I just don't see how those premises support the conclusion. See, way I'm thinking about it, these premises make sense and I agree with them, but it doesn't follow from that it's morally wrong. That could be another part. That's a support issue. That is refutation. That is awesome. That is a good first step in a disagreement. You know what Dr. Chapman can do with this? Dr. Chapman can be like, all right, yes, thank you. All right, let's start talking about premise 2 now. So you think we should focus on the corporations as being blameworthy? I think we should focus on ourselves individually for being blameworthy. Great. Now let me talk about why I think all of us individually are blameworthy. Why I think my buying meat causes suffering. And now we can have a back and forth. And it's productive because we're both trying to figure out whether premise 2 is true, whether premise 2 is false, what we should think about this one part of the argument. We are trying to learn together whether this is a quality argument. So, by the way, for what it's worth, I am not going to talk about refuting the central point. I think of refutation. I don't think there's really a central point in an argument. You probably confuse that with the conclusion. But refutation always happens on the side of the premises, right? The argument exists in the premises, not just the conclusion. So I don't really think there's a difference between refuting the central point and refutation. Refutation is the highest. And if you remember, I wanted to play you a excerpt from a podcast a couple live sessions ago. It was about the joy of refutation. I wound up not being able to play it for you because I got flustered, but I did send a link out later. If you listen to that conversation between the philosopher Agnes Callard and I forget the person who was interviewing her, Agnes Callard was talking about how refutation is a gift. If you go around offering refutations to people's arguments, Agnes Callard thinks you're providing a gift to people. You are helping people learn. You are helping people grow in this sort of way. And so what Agnes Callard says is, in the reverse, she wants to be the sort of person who receives refutations of her own arguments as gifts. She wants to be open-minded enough to listen to people when they're attempting to refute her arguments, for the possibility that they really have successfully refuted her, and that now she has to change her mind. And what she thought was a good argument for her conclusion is no longer a good argument. And maybe what she has to do is change. And that's good. If you don't think of it as a competition that you just lost because now you have to change your mind, you can think of this as a really positive moment because you have to change your mind, but that's just what learning is. Learning is forming new beliefs, maybe getting rid of old beliefs or revising and updating old beliefs so that you're gaining a better understanding and more clarity on the world. That's a positive thing. It's only seen as a negative thing if you're viewing disagreements as a competition, where there are winners and losers, where there's just like a scoreboard, where the number of burns you have has to be more than the number of burns your opponent has. If you think of it all like that, you're going to be at these lower levels. You're going to be at responding to tone and ad hominem and name calling. That's where all the point scoring happens. If you care about learning and growing, you got to be up here at refutation. That's the main goal. That's the real goal of intellectually productive conversations. All right, so all I want to do now is just introduce you to something that we're going to discuss in much greater detail at another time. And that is this sort of activity. I mentioned in that final slide that this is a good first step to a disagreement. Well, now I want to show you just in general what dialectical inquiry looks like. Dialectical reasoning is a process of disagreeing in a conversation in a productive way. So we refer to it as a dialectic because that's just a fancy word for a conversation. The word dialectic is related to the word dialogue, like a conversation between two people. A dialectic is a particular conversation between two people where they start from different perspectives. They start on different sides of an issue. And dialectical inquiry is where you're using that type of conversation method to inquire about the world, to try to figure out whether a particular argument is good or bad, whether a particular claim makes sense or doesn't make sense. So you're using conversation as a way to inquire and understand the world. Now, our first move in a conversation, as we already mentioned, is to bring up a refutation. A criticism is another word for a refutation, right? You can criticize, again, either the truth or the support of the argument. You might want to take a look at one of these premises. In this case, we're focusing on premise 1 in this one. Maybe you look at premise 1 of this argument and you say, I don't agree with that premise. Here's my criticism of that premise. That's the first move in a conversation. The next move in a conversation is you let the person who likes this argument respond to your criticism. I've sort of simplified on this handout right here the perspective of the critic on the one hand, who doesn't like this argument, and the fan on the other hand, who does like this argument. So imagine this is a conversation between a critic and a fan, a critic of the argument and a fan of the argument. Once our critic has put forward their criticism, it's the fan's chance now to reply and to say, no, maybe this is a clarification. You don't know what I mean. You're criticizing something about premise 1, but that's not what I mean to say. So what I mean to say in this premise is this. Or maybe what you do is you revise your premise and you say, you know what? The way I've worded my argument right now, you're right. That is a good criticism, but I think I can revise what I said in such a way that your criticism no longer applies. Or maybe what you want to do is defend your argument and say, no, here's my evidence against what you're saying about premise 1 that tries to defend why I think premise 1 is true. Or maybe at this point in the conversation, you could concede. Conceding is just saying, you know what, you're right, I agree. That's you changing your mind. That's you saying, wow, you made a good point, I agree. You're actually right. If you ever concede at this point, the conversation's over. The dialectic has ended and your inquiry has reached a result. You figured something out. Let's say though, in this particular case, our fan defends the argument. Well, that's just the second step in a conversation. Then what you get to do is listen to the critic and hear what the critic has to say in response. Maybe the fan has replied with a defense, but our critic has a criticism about that defense, or maybe just wants to question it. Sometimes your criticism is not a devastating criticism to say you're definitely wrong in that premise. Maybe it's more like, I don't really understand what you're saying at this point. I feel like I could interpret it a few different ways. Could you clarify what you mean in premise 1? And as always, any one of them at any time could concede. A critic at this point could concede and say, you know what, that's a great defense. I didn't think of it that way, but I think that makes total sense now that you're saying it. And then this could continue going on and on and on. The fan replies, the critic replies to that fan reply, the fan replies to the critic reply of the fan's reply, so on and so forth, until you reach a point where somebody concedes. With the critic concedes, says, you know what, actually you're right. I now think this premise is a good premise. Excellent. All right, let's move on. Maybe now we can discuss premise 2. And now it's premise 2 time. Or maybe it's not the critic who concedes, maybe it's the fan who ultimately concedes. And if it's the fan of the argument who ultimately concedes in this back and forth, then the fan gets to say, wow, okay, this argument is not as good as I thought. I guess what I should do now is go back to the drawing board and maybe see if I can come up with another argument for this conclusion. If not, maybe I should just suspend judgment on this conclusion and say, I don't know whether this conclusion is true. more research. That's a productive way to learn and a productive way to grow. And you see, they're coming from different perspectives, the fan and the critic, but their goal is the same. They're both trying to figure out the answer. They're both trying to learn together. So Shantae asked whether this is homework. This is absolutely not homework. This is, as you see on the top here, an in-class activity that I'm not even going to ask us to do right now. I'd actually like to save it to the beginning of next class. We will be doing it as an in-class activity. And as a little bit of a reminder, I'll show you on Blackboard right now. You can find this in-class activity right here, right under our live session. I'm just referencing it now. You don't have to do this. You do not have to hand it in. This is not graded. This is nothing you have to do. The only thing you have to do that's graded in this class is, for this week, is the test. By the way, there's not even a discussion board this week. You don't even have to do any discussion board posting in class this week. All you have to do is the test. Now, the last thing I want to end class with is just a little bit of an introduction to the paper that is due in this class at the end of the semester. So I've put a little bit of a description of the paper right here. And it says here at the end of the semester, you're going to be writing and handing in a paper. This paper is not due this unit. It's going to be due December 18th. That's literally the last day of the semester. But I'm introducing this paper right now. It relates to what we've been learning in class this week. Clicking on this PDF, it's going to get you to the guideline of the paper. Let's talk a little bit about this paper. This paper asks you to read what's called an adversarial collaboration. A nerdy website has organized a handful of people to write up their thoughts on a particular topic, where the two of them on that topic are adversaries. So let's say, for instance, this first topic, the benefits of infant circumcision. Joel P. and Massigno are on different sides of the circumcision debate. Let's say Joel P. thinks that infant circumcision is morally okay, and Massigno thinks that infant circumcision is morally wrong. What they did is they worked together, even though they were adversaries. They collaborated together to write this article right here. And you could choose this article to write your paper on, or you could choose the one that's about eating meat, or the one about colonizing space to mitigate the risk that humans go extinct, or gene editing for humans, or abortion, or whether automation is going to lead to an economic crisis, or the significance of spiritual experiences. Each one of these are open-minded people who are engaged in a dialectic, trying to come together to figure out their thoughts on this topic, where originally they are adversaries on different sides of the topic. So for this paper, what you want to do is read one of these. You can choose which one of the 7 to write about, and you want to follow the rest of the prompts on here. Shantae asked, when is their due? You can scroll down here. It's due December 18th. It's due a long time from now. I'm just introducing it to you now because we're talking about intellectually productive disagreements and the whole idea of a dialectic process. So I want you to choose one of these adversarial collaboration articles. Pick a topic you have a strong opinion about. If you haven't thought about infant circumcision one way or the other, don't choose that one. If you don't feel that strongly about abortion or don't feel that strongly about gene editing technology, don't pick that one. Pick the one where you already have a strong opinion one way or the other. And then you have to write a short essay about this, just 500 to 800 words. First, just briefly describe your initial opinion on the topic before reading the article, and then describe how you felt while reading these two sides in this adversarial conversation. And then describe how reading this adversarial collaboration shifted your thoughts on the topic. Maybe you learned something. What did you learn? Did you become more confident in your original opinion? Did you become less confident in your original opinion? Did you change your mind completely? Why? What led to these shifts? And then finally, explain whatever questions you might still have about the topic that you could maybe do some further research on. You don't have to do the research itself for this final section for this paper. You just have to describe what lingering doubts you might still have about this topic, what questions still remain in your mind. This is a short paper. 500 to 800 words is like 2 to 3 pages as an essay goes, somewhere around that length. And it's worth 10% of your overall grade or 100 points. I recommend thinking about this now. Obviously, you don't have to completely write this and hand it in this week. It's due December 18th, but it's a good idea to start thinking about this now, maybe reading the particular adversarial article that interests you. Najwa asked whether I want the paper to be double-spaced. Barbara asked NLA format. I don't give a damn. You can space it however you want. You can format it however you want. I don't care about that stuff. Just make sure it's this many words, 500 to 800 words. And I'm pretty good at figuring that out, no matter whether it's single-spaced, double-spaced, triple-spaced, whatever your fonts or margins are. And Monique asks whether we can hand it in early and whether I could give feedback on a draft. Absolutely. If you want to give me a draft of this today or sometime in the middle of October or sometime early November or sometime towards the end of November, please give me that draft. I'll absolutely give you feedback on it. And then you can revise based off of my feedback. All right, so that's a paper. Again, as a reminder, not due this week, just introducing it because it's related to what we're talking about. The only thing that's due this week is the test. We're basically done for the day. If anyone has questions or concerns, you can stick around. I'll be hanging out on this live session for the next couple minutes. But otherwise, I will see you all next week. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. Have yourselves a good little lifetime. I can do this. I'm just trying to put on some music, y'all. There we go. Bye, y'all.